Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History. Episode 89, The Republic Strikes Back. Surrounded, betrayed, and seemingly on the brink of collapse, the summer of 1793 was a dark era for the nation. Forced to revolutionize its army and embrace total war, the final months of the year saw something completely unexpected. Unbelievable success. From Flanders to the Alps, from the Rhineland to the Pyrenees, victories replaced defeats. The revolution was back. But before we examine this heroic resurgence, thank you to the community for making all of this possible. Grey History remains in the fight thanks to the generous support of its listeners, and you can do your part by joining the revolution. In donating a coffee or two each month, your small contribution will ensure more Grey History, both now and in the future. With ad-free listening and hours of fantastic bonus content, there's plenty to enjoy while creating history that isn't black and white. So please support the show today at patreon.com. Speaking of revolutionary citizens, it's with immense pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the virtuous citizens, Adrian, Douglas, and Lachlan. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Sean, Keel, and Amy. Lastly, thank you again to every community member, including the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. When we last left the War of the First Coalition, France faced disaster. The Belgian frontier had been compromised, while the Rhineland was effectively lost. With Condé and Valenciennes taken by the enemy, Paris lay exposed, while eastern France was equally defenceless thanks to the surrender of mines. To make matters worse, Spain had invaded the southwest, Piedmont Sardinia threatened the southeast, and by the end of August, neighbouring Toulon had defected to the enemy. Ignoring the considerable threat of the Vendéans in western France and the Federalist revolts remaining in Lyon and Bordeaux, the Republic battled 5 foreign enemies across multiple frontiers. Faced with imminent defeat, the Convention mobilised every citizen and embraced total war. Desperately striking in every direction, success or lack of it would shape the course of history. To begin our tour of 5 armies, it perhaps makes sense to start with the Anglo-Austrians along the Belgian border. After sitting on their hands following Dumouriez's attempted coup, the lethargic allies had slowly besieged key fortifications. With Condé and Valenciennes taken in July, the road was clear to march on Paris. But, as discussed in episode 86, the British had other ideas. London desired Dunkirk, and thus, from early August, we get a marvellous seaside adventure. In theory, the British assault would go something like this. Having aided the Austrians in securing the road between Brussels and Paris, York's mixed force of British, Hanoverian and Hessian troops would swing northwest towards Dunkirk. Besieging the port with more aggressive tactics than those favoured by the Austrians, this undoubtedly quick affair would be assisted by the Royal Navy. However, despite the shortcomings of Republican soldiers, the Dunkirk campaign had a few critical vulnerabilities. Firstly, York's troops may have numbered an impressive 35,000, but they lacked appropriate artillery for a siege. These guns had to arrive from England, and without them, even the neglected defences of Dunkirk would remain difficult to overcome. Secondly, while York could besiege the port from land, an investment was useless without a blockade from the sea. Unless the Royal Navy arrived in sufficient force, the French could easily resupply and bolster the defence. Finally, the separation of British and Austrian forces diluted their commanding position in the centre of the Belgian frontier. Between Dunkirk and the newly taken French forts, a sizable gap arose, separating the coalition armies. Theoretically, this gulf was occupied by the small Dutch army stationed north of Lille. Emphasis on the small. Should the Republic strike, the French could sever the Allies in two. Having departed the Austrians earlier that month, York and his army of various nationalities arrived at Dunkirk on the 24th of August. York promptly split his army into two, a besieging force tasked with subduing the port, and an observation force used to cover the exposed besiegers. However, almost immediately, issues began to arise. In particular, the weather. Severe storms and rough conditions meant that reinforcements were constantly interrupted. So hostile were the conditions that York's much-needed cannons could only be unloaded in a friendly port to the north, rather than directly at the siege. Desperate for suitable firepower, the commander even took guns from a frigate to begin shelling the city. Worse still, the Royal Navy remained missing in action, even when the weather was favourable. In contrast, the French response was far more energetic. As York marched on Dunkirk, Carnot, the famed organiser of victory, had been elevated to the Committee of Public Safety. 2 days later, the famed levée en masse was proclaimed, and every man, woman and child was mobilised for the defence of the Republic. Thereafter, Carnot became determined to halt the British advance, prioritising it for political rather than military reasons. For Carnot, the British were the glue holding the coalition together. A defeat here might not only weaken the enemy's resolve, but potentially trigger a revolution in England itself. Thus, having personally inspected Dunkirk's crumbling defences earlier that year, Carnot knew that time was of the essence. Accordingly, Carnot drew manpower from across the northern frontier, in a desperate attempt to mass a considerable relief force. Critically, the relative inaction of both the Prussians and Austrians enabled him to not only use new conscripts, but reassign soldiers from other parts of the front. Come September, as rain drenched York's near gunless besiegers, word reached the French army of the north. Their former commander, Custine, was dead. The execution of his predecessor spurred Custine's replacement into action. General Houchard was a political appointee, a non-noble officer who was great in the saddle but unqualified for more senior command. Nonetheless, Custine's execution seems to have provided a sudden sense of urgency, as did his orders from Carnot. Knowing that Dunkirk would fall quickly once the British could actually execute their plan, the French decided to attack before either the British Navy or artillery arrived in sufficient force. Yet, even prior to the French advance, the Duke of York was by now having a miserable time. With few heavy guns and the navy still missing, the Duke's men could do little but twiddle their thumbs in the rain. Moreover, with each passing day, the situation was getting worse. Firstly, the French defenders of Dunkirk had opened the floodgates. With canals and dikes covering the region, rising water levels risked severing communication between the Duke's two forces. Secondly, the absence of the navy enabled French gunboats to operate unmolested. The Duke's right flank was thus being shelled with little way to reply, while the terrain rendered digging dry trenches all but impossible. Finally, the Dutch army that was theoretically defending the gap between York and Coburg, well, you guessed it. The Duke lamented the usual cowardice of the Dutch as the stadholder's forces experienced unexpected setbacks from French assaults. In short, the siege was not going to plan, and that was before General Hondschoote rocked up with 40,000 Republicans. On the 6th of September, the French launched their attack. Marching northwards from Cassel, the French spread out in a wide, multi-pronged assault. Facing them was the Allied Army of Observation, a force of perhaps 15,000 that York established further south to cover his exposed besiegers. Critically, the understandable division of his troops meant that the Allied Army of Observation was outnumbered. Led by the Field Marshal Wilhelm von Freytag, this force was primarily Hanoverian and Hessian, and it's these, rather than British troops, that will actually fight the most important Anglo-French battle of 1793. In a strategy that is quite controversial amongst historians, Freytag had ordered his troops to seize a variety of locations before the village of Hondschoote, a small community to the southeast of Dunkirk. While these positions secured possible routes to the port, they also thinned the Allied line further, rendering French manpower all the more important. With the French attacking en masse, fierce fighting ensued. Despite their considerable numerical advantage, the Republic was barely winning. Untested citizens were confronting combat veterans, and the disciplined Germans made a valiant and hard-fought defence. Eventually, the Allies were overpowered, and what followed was a chaotic, nay, shambolic retreat. As the French had attacked in multiple prongs, some coalition forces unknowingly withdrew straight into the enemy. This happened to Field Marshal Freytag himself, who was briefly captured as a result. Yet, with the Allied Army of Observation in retreat towards Hondschoote, this was hardly a great victory for the French. Historian Robert Palmer characterises the day as indecisive, while John Fortescue notes the relatively poor outcome given the French at times outnumbered their opponents 10-1. Now, truth be told, Fortescue is one of these English scholars who is usually keen to play up British accomplishments, although in this case he is quite critical of their commander, the Hanoverian Freytag. Nonetheless, even French historians find shortcomings with their own countrymen. Arthur Chouquet, for example, remarks that, despite their superiority in numbers, Hondschoote had not been able to destroy or capture a single detachment of the defence. The following day, the 7th of September, produced no meaningful results. Exhausted from the day prior, when Hondschoote attempted to follow up his minor victories, his troops proved disorganised and fearful. Unable to mount a serious advance, the climax of the battle would have to wait. Importantly, for those who would later condemn Hondschoote's leadership, his inaction on the 7th of September was one of the many unforgivable mistakes. Thus, on the 8th of September, we get the grand conclusion of the Battle of Hondschoote. With the Duke's main force still focused on besieging Dunkirk to the north, the defence of the British position remained entrusted to a mixed force of primarily Hanoverians, Hessians, and Austrians. While Freytag had been rescued from his brief captivity, he was injured nonetheless, and so command fell to Valmoden, another Hanoverian. Valmoden had chosen to make his stand before Hondschoote, a position which was not exactly ideal. That said, his primary goal was covering York's besieging force to the north, and the commander was thus limited in his options. Facing southwards towards the French, Valmodin established several redoubts and an entrenched artillery position. His guns were facing the main road towards the nearby town of Killam, spelt Killem. Given the events that followed, I'd say the name Killam was eerily appropriate. Critically, heavy rains had rendered much of the region arduous, and the road was the most obvious approach for the French. To his right was a series of wetlands and canals which would make flanking difficult, while his left was broken, a muddy maze of hedges and ditches. This would have hindered the movement and cohesion of any attacking force attempting to outflank his left. Thus, Valmodin anticipated a direct assault from the French, for better or worse. Yes, this would allow the Allies to concentrate their firepower in a singular direction, but the terrain was unsuitable for the British cavalry, relegating one of their most powerful advantages. For the advancing French, disagreements arose on when and where to strike. Noting the difficulty of assaulting Valmodin's right flank, attacking the left was debatably still possible. The challenging terrain was broken with hedges and ditches, but some officers believed a flanking manoeuvre was advisable. However, General Hondschoote was having none of it. Instead, he decided to approach from the centre, up the main road just as Valmodin had predicted. Consequently, the French advanced straight into the Hanoverian artillery. Actually, did I say advance? No, that's completely wrong. What I meant to say was stood still under fire. You see, in the preceding days, the French had been engaged in multi-pronged assaults across a wide front. While most of his forces were with him, Hondschoote had ordered nearby units to converge and encircle Hondschoote. Knowing that reinforcements were on the way, the French decided to wait. But the only problem with this strategy was that their main force had already formed up for battle. Consequently, Valmodin's guns opened fire, sending round after round into Hondschoote's exposed columns. Vigorous debate erupted amongst the French, and junior generals, including the future Marshal Jourdan, pressed Hondschoote to attack. Fearful of advancing without all his men, Hondschoote refused to budge. With nerves escalating, one representative on mission, a deputy named Pierre Delbrel, seized the initiative. Riding upon a white horse directly in front of the Hanoverian artillery, Delbrel rallied the men. However, the men had had enough. Why wait for a cannonball to kill you when you could at least try to shoot the enemy? Hondschoote had already allowed some skirmishers to engage the foe, but now multiple units broke ranks and charged. Running towards the defenders, the regular infantry were now fighting as skirmishers, individual fighters embracing the daring and bold essence of the fabled French élan. Using hedges and ditches to provide cover, the scattered French got within musket range and started peppering the defence. Demonstrating the effectiveness of deploying untrained men as light infantry, the broken terrain of the battlefield enabled the Republicans to harass their adversaries with ease. After all, what good was the firepower of a proper line formation when the bullets were hitting vegetation? Faced with this unorthodox assault from French skirmishers, the Allies advanced. The approach of the disciplined Germans routed the French, who broke and fled in the face of flashing bayonets. Critically, their general almost followed suit. With retreating troops pouring back towards the army, General Hondschoote considered retreating himself. Although heavily outnumbered, Valmodin's defence was proving unexpectedly resilient. Now, just why that was surprising when Hondschoote had so far refused to commit to the battle in any decisive way, I'm not sure. But then again, Hondschoote will be executed within weeks, in part for his incompetence. But With the military leadership ready to withdraw, the political leadership filled the void. Re-enter the representatives on mission. Demonstrating the power of the convention on the battlefield itself, the deputy Pierre Delbrel disparaged Houchar's resolve. With so many volunteers prone to flight, Delbrel detailed the anarchy that would result if the order to retreat was given. Instead, Delbrel's solution was the opposite. The French must attack. Other officers agreed, including General Jourdan. Houchard relented, but gave his subordinate Jourdan strict instructions. Jourdan was only to lead the centre into battle once Houchard had commenced the attack on the right. In turn, the French division on the left would assault after the advance of the centre, creating a staged wave which was, hopefully, irresistible. But with Houchard gone to prepare the right flank, cannon fire continued to chew up the French. Once again, soldiers broke ranks and advanced as skirmishers. A repeat of the prior action ensued, with terrain providing effective cover until the Allies advanced. Consequently, Jourdan now had a humongous problem. With the French once more retreating from the field, Jourdan and Representative Delbrel attempted to rally the men, a second time. Soldiers were fleeing past them with pace, and the French centre was on the precipice of collapse. Fast thinking, Jourdan proposed to bring up the final battalion of reserves and use the dormant French cavalry to halt and forcibly return the fleeing infantry. Knowing that the left division was waiting for the advance of the centre, Jourdan informed Delbrel that should the reserves charge, the column would grow like a snowball as it advanced towards the enemy. Not only would wavering and retreating soldiers be compelled to rejoin the attack, but the left flank would join in, providing a devastating assault. But in order to do so, Jourdan would have to disobey Houchard's direct orders. He had told him to wait for the French charge on the right. Knowing full well the risks of ignoring an order and failing, especially at a time of purges and executions, Jourdan was unwilling to enact such disobedience. Unless, of course, it wasn't disobedience. Delbrel got the hint. As a representative on mission, as a deputy of the people, Delbrel ordered Jourdan to advance. You fear the responsibility. Well, I take everything upon myself, and I give you the formal order to attack immediately. My authority takes precedence over that of the General-in-Chief, and you cannot hesitate. Declaring himself now Jourdan's subordinate, the deputy, a former civilian with little military training, ran to fetch the cavalry and reserves. However, as he brought the men back to Jourdan, Delbrel hit a problem. More accurately, a problem hit Jourdan. A bullet had grazed the general. A mortal wound it was not, but Jourdan was hardly fit to lead. Finding him in such a state, I can only presume the four-letter word that ran through Delbrel's mind. But the deputy was proving himself more than capable under fire, and so he ordered the charge. To the cries of "Long live the nation" and "Long live the Republic," the French surged forward behind this fancily dressed politician whose feather-filled hat showed the way. The French division on the left saw the centre advance, and so they too joined the fray. With the broken terrain unsuitable for traditional formations, not to mention the men's lack of training, the French once again embraced open-order combat, dispersing as skirmishers to fight freely and independently across the battlefield. Hiding behind hedges and even in ditches and canals, the French firestorm was withering, halting the Hanoverian advance. At this point, Houchard finally arrived on the right with cavalry. Houchard was once more in his element, and the French assaulted the Allied flank effectively, despite the difficult terrain. The defenders were briefly driven back, but they regrouped and recommenced their advance. Yet, momentum now lay with the French. Their enthusiasm was becoming infectious, encouraging persistence and rallying courage which had hitherto been temperamental. The advancing Allies still routed some units with the threat of bayonets, but the retreating French were orderly, determined, and quickly ready to re-engage. More importantly, however, the Allied counterattack was unsustainable. After hours of bitter fighting, the defenders were almost out of ammunition. With French reinforcements finally arriving from elsewhere, just as Hondschoote had originally intended, Valmodon risked encirclement. Retreat was ordered. Covered by a stubborn rearguard, the Allies pulled back, destroying bridges over the waterlogged countryside to impede a French pursuit. Hondschoote had fallen. The French had won. The Battle of Hondschoote was not a glorious victory. It was a precarious and ill-disciplined affair, one which the Republicans could just as easily have lost. However, regardless of the mistakes and missed opportunities, this was a victory nonetheless. For a cost of perhaps 2,000 casualties, Valmodon was forced to retreat, and thus so too was the Duke of York. Risking his own encirclement if he did not move with haste, the British were even compelled to leave their heavy guns as they frantically abandoned Dunkirk. Vulnerable, exposed, and some distance from their Austrian allies, additional engagements might well have pushed the scattered enemy into the sea. Unfortunately for the French, this was not to be. Neither of the Duke's forces were given serious harassment, enabling the British to regroup and remain an effective fighting force. This was Hondschoote's second unforgivable mistake, and future setbacks would soon encourage his denunciation and subsequent arrest. Yet, for all the faults of Hondschoote's command, Dunkirk was saved. For months, the enemy's advance had seemed unstoppable. From Belgium to Toulon, the Rhineland to the Pyrenees, the First Coalition had scored success after success. Much work remained for the French, but in the battlefields of Flanders, the Republic had finally struck back. However, while the British forces had been bloodied, the successful retreat of the Duke of York had kept their threat alive and well. Indeed, the English were soon scoring minor victories across Flanders, and their defeat at Dunkirk only enabled an even greater danger. Unable to secure his primary objective, the path was now clear for the Duke to return to the Austrians. In short, the coalition could reunite. A combined Anglo-Austrian force could neutralise the Republic's manpower advantage and crush the poorly disciplined French. It's here that we should check in with the Austrians under Prince Coburg. After the sieges of Valenciennes and Condé, the British had of course marched to Dunkirk. Lacking both the means and will to march on Paris alone, Coburg had remained focused on key border fortresses. The first target for the Austrians was the small fort of Le Quesnoy, some 9 miles or 15 kilometres southeast of Valenciennes. Just off the main road from Brussels to Paris, Le Quesnoy would make a fine addition to the Austrian collection. Interestingly, the terms of surrender just 2 weeks later offer a fascinating glimpse into the changing nature of the war. Prior to Le Quesnoy, French defenders were often released after their capitulation. Terms were attached to these paroles, often limiting their deployment in the future. For example, when the Prussians took Mainz in July 1793, the French garrison had to promise not to fight against the coalition for an entire year. Such agreements were common and reflected the very gentlemanly nature of 18th century warfare. However, the convention was being a little clever with these arrangements. Conveniently, the French government noted that, technically, the Vendée rebels were not part of the First Coalition. Thus, French prisoners of war were thus being released by the Allies, only to see them re-engage in combat in western France. To state the obvious, the Allies were not amused. As such, the defenders of Le Quesnoy would remain prisoners. Slowly but surely, the nature of 18th century conflicts was changing into something far more modern. With Le Quesnoy taken on September 11, the Austrians were free to assist the British. York's forces had retreated from Dunkirk on September 8, and the two forces were now in a position to close the gap that had hampered cooperation for the previous month. French and coalition forces tangled in mid-September north of the city of Lille, and the embarrassing performance of the Army of the North is what put the final nail in the coffin for poor General Hondschoote. No longer at risk of being overwhelmed in retreat, the British successfully defended Belgium against multiple incursions. In the meantime, the Austrians returned eastwards to claim the last jewel of the frontier fortifications, Maubeuge. Together with Condé, Valenciennes and Le Quesnoy, the Austrians would have a formidable position in which to assail northern France. Furthermore, these were quite some prizes at the negotiating table, able to either bolster the Austrian Netherlands or sweeten the deal in the desired exchange of Belgium for Bavaria. But as Coburg's army marched east towards Maubeuge, the French had other ideas. It's here that we should more formally introduce General Jourdan, whose performance at Hondschoote had not gone unnoticed. Born in 1762, Jourdan was a haberdasher peddling clothing and fabric at the time of the Revolution's eruption. A believer in its principles, he joined the local National Guard before enlisting in the so-called volunteer battalions. In a prior life, Jourdan had served as a private during the American Revolutionary War, meaning that he was one of the few volunteers with actual military experience. Consequently, his peers elected him their commander. Perhaps surprisingly, this former private turned out to be quite the capable officer, an ironic development given that his talents would have remained wasted in the old Royal Army. Within months, Jourdan was promoted multiple times, and his career soon ballooned through a mixture of top-down promotions and bottom-up election. By Dunkirk, he was already a general of division, taking his orders directly from Hondschoote as commander-in-chief. With Hondschoote removed, Jourdan was the new head of the Army of the North. Of course, Hondschoote had considered his promotion a curse, and I'm sure that wasn't lost on Jourdan. Apparently, he even tried to decline the offer, perhaps knowing that all of his predecessors had met less than desirable ends. Armed with enthusiasm to save the Republic, and his own life, Jourdan was determined to rescue Maubeuge. Backing him was the Committee of Public Safety, in particular Carnot. In fact, Carnot would support the effort personally. Indeed, one of the great misconceptions of the committee is that all 12 men remained in Paris and governed as a collective council. Instead, many were deployed as representatives on mission, at least for a period of time. We've already seen Couthon and Collot d'Herbois in Lyon, while Lindais suppressed the Federalists in Normandy. Carnot's revolution of the army was not possible solely from the capital, and in October he joined the Army of the North. For the organiser of Victory, and for the entire committee, success was absolutely essential. Historian Robert Palmer notes the political implications of anything less than triumph. It was vital for the Republic to save Maubeuge. Coburg occupied Valenciennes, Condé and Le Quesnoy. With Maubeuge, he would take a compact group of fortresses, a base for an advance on Paris, or at least a place to winter on French soil. In proportion as Coburg succeeded, the Committee of Public Safety would be accused of having failed. If Coburg took Maubeuge, the committee might be ruined. Moderates would blame its policy of suspended army officers. Radicals would cry out, for the 1,000th time, "We are betrayed." The Jacobins and the Commune would again storm the convention, demand more terror, more vigour, and more purity. Perhaps, who knows, even Robespierre would find himself branded as the slave of despots. In short, politics, as well as the public safety, demanded that the committee be triumphant. Yet, for all the importance of the coming battle, this fight would not be easy. The difficulties facing the French were immense, and Carnot's reforms would take time. The deficiencies of the French position are highlighted keenly by the issue of supply. From horses to uniforms, from bread to weapons, the Army of the North lacked almost every necessity. For example, insufficient horses rendered equipment, foodstuffs, and artillery immovable, while cavalry were diminished to little more than glorified skirmishers. Likewise, the need to feed Paris took precedence over the army, resulting in considerable food shortages for the troops in nearby regions. Munitions, cannonballs, muskets, proper shoes, everything was woefully inadequate. Carnot pleaded with Paris to send 15,000 bayonets, while some in the government even proposed the use of bows and arrows to mitigate the shortage of weapons. Before you laugh, the Republic was seriously manufacturing pikes, the only weapon available for some units. Combine all of this with the fact that so many soldiers were untrained, underfed, exhausted, and afraid. This desperate, ragged, and inexperienced force was hardly ready for the task. But the French had no other options. For Jourdan and Carnot, the overarching strategy was simple. With roughly 45,000 men, the Army of the North would approach Coburg's besieging force from the south. Like the British at Dunkirk, the Austrians were split between the siege lines and a covering army. Thus, it was the latter which Jourdan would attack, numbering about 37,000 troops. Critically, this force was extended over an incredibly wide front, meaning only about 21,000 would actually engage in the coming battle. Thus, the French would attempt to mitigate their deficiencies through aggression, speed, and overwhelming manpower. Outnumbering the enemy almost 2-1, Carnot would use this battle to observe and experiment with his new military doctrine firsthand. Importantly, with Jourdan advancing from the south, the defenders of Maubeuge would launch a raid against the siege lines before the fort. Both sides anticipated this manoeuvre, as Maubeuge's garrison numbered roughly 20,000 men. True, Coburg's besieging force was comparable, perhaps slightly larger, but that force was also split by the Sambre River, meaning that, once again, the French would have a substantial numerical advantage. With a bit of luck, the French could sandwich Coburg's forces and inflict a tremendous victory. However, few plans survived first contact with the enemy, and this was no different. The main event of this famous clash occurred at the village of Wattignies, some 6 miles or 10 kilometres south of Maubeuge. On the 15th of October, the French launched their attack. Their plan was ambitious, to say the least. While the Austrians had debatably made a critical mistake by overextending their lines, the French seemed to repeat it. Instead of focusing on one point, the Republic engaged the enemy at numerous locations. Irrelevant of where they were attacked, the French were forced back. Carnot and Jourdan argued bitterly over tactics, and Carnot's interventions remain a source of much controversy. Whoever was at fault, the costs of these mistakes were considerable. Inexperienced and exhausted, the Republicans were chewed up by Austrian artillery. Elsewhere, Allied cavalry sliced through exposed and disorientated units, while miscommunication, or perhaps just cowardice, further hampered the French advance. By the end of the day, the Republic had been mauled. It's claimed that before the battle, Prince Coburg was so confident of victory that he was willing to become a sans-culotte if the Austrians were defeated. At least on the 15th, the prince had no need for trousers. Yet, the French were willing to innovate with speed, and Carnot and Jourdan formulated a new plan. Spotting a weakness in the Austrian lines, the French would concentrate their assault on the Austrians' left flank. Interestingly, the advance would not only depend on French numerical advantage, but also combined artillery and different types of infantry in a coordinated assault. Now, to give you a sense of just how much manpower the French had at their disposal, historian Ramsay Phipps believes that the French right flank numbered more than the entire Austrian defence. While the battlefield numbers are always a little fuzzy, such a differential in troops was simply phenomenal. Critically, for this plan to work, the Austrians could not reinforce their left flank. As such, the rest of the army would be held in place by French skirmishers. With light infantry engaging the defence across their extended line, the coalition would struggle to fortify their fragile left wing. The next day, the 16th of October, a thick fog descended upon the troops. This was advantageous to the French, who could use the gloom to prepare their mass assaults. While fighting erupted in mid-morning, the Republicans charged twice. In both instances, they failed. With the raw recruits fast losing heart, their officers desperately rallied the men. Representatives on mission were also in the thick of it, and inspirational cries soon salvaged the advance. The French would try one last time. Outmanned and outgunned, the Austrian defence was hammered by a seemingly endless barrage of both artillery and personnel. The former was critical, and many historians praise the French guns as the decisive factor. In the face of this renewed aggression, the Allies fell back. Given the position of the Austrian left wing, the village of Wattignies fell to the French. The exhausted sides disengaged and paused to catch their breath. Come nightfall, Jourdan was convinced that an Austrian counterattack would arrive the next morning. To be fair, this was a reasonable assumption. From a critical lens, the French had won the day. They had not won a major victory, and the Austrians could reinforce their army by pulling troops from the siege lines. Moreover, for some unfathomable reason, the besiegers had not been engaged by the French garrison in Maubeuge. This meant that Coburg could spare additional and well-rested men. Furthermore, the Duke of York was now rushing to assist him. True, British forces were depleted thanks to a combination of defending the Belgian border and, get ready for it, London withdrawing troops. Yes, you heard that right. After the failures of Dunkirk, British soldiers were withdrawn to focus on the Caribbean, or perhaps even Toulon. Indeed, the endless contradictions of British war aims never disappoint. But, while not as formidable as previous weeks, the Duke was racing to Maubeuge nonetheless. Given these factors, a third day of battle was certainly possible. Yet, it was not to be. Coburg faced no shortage of difficulties in addition to York's absence. French reinforcements continued to pour north, while his own fractious alliance was giving him serious grief. Like York's forces, the men under Coburg's command were not exclusively Austrian. French émigrés were present, and so too were the Dutch. Notably, the Dutch army was hardly in the mood for a bold and daring stand. Having been spanked near Lille in August and September, the Dutch stadtholder was increasingly disinterested in the conflict. The French may have invaded his country, but internal unrest made his position dangerously fragile. Remember, The Upper Netherlands had seen a low-scale civil war in 1787, and its prince had only been saved by Prussian military intervention. Additionally, the stadtholder believed that the Allies had not yet promised sufficient indemnities for his efforts. Given this mixture of grievance, vulnerability, and previous setbacks, the Dutch refused to transfer additional men across the Sambre River. Unable to reinforce his army, the characteristically cautious Coburg was inclined to retreat instead. When all was said and done, both sides had suffered about 3,000 casualties, totaling roughly 5% of their respective total strengths. Thus, with the Battle of Wattignies ending on the 16th of October, the siege of Maubeuge was lifted. Under the cover of darkness, the Austrians made their move. Given that retreat entailed the crossing of the Sambre River, the coalition was expecting difficulties. Caught mid-act after 2 days of battle, a timely French assault could have been disastrous. But in one of the many similarities to the Battle of Hondschoote, the French just didn't have it in them. Maubeuge's garrison remained inactive, while Jourdan's forces were both exhausted and preparing for an expected counterattack. By the next day, it was clear that Jourdan had repeated Houchar's blunder. The enemy had been allowed to escape. Luckily for the general, Wattignies was proclaimed a great victory, at least in official propaganda. Combined with sufficient support amongst some representatives on mission, the commander would keep his head. Just. Jourdan would soon be deprived of his command, in part due to disagreements with his civilian bosses, including Carnot. However, don't worry, Jourdan will return in mid-1794 to achieve another of the Republic's most consequential victories. And that brings us to the matter of importance. Taking a step back from the fighting, what should we make of this bloody and hard-fought affair? Well, I've already pointed out some parallels to the Battle of Hondschoote, and a closer examination reveals 3 more similarities. Firstly, like Hondschoote, the Battle of Wattignies was a tale of mistakes and missed opportunities. The first day showed the limits of audacious plans with untrained citizen soldiers, and the subsequent success on the second was both costly and indecisive. Moreover, the enemy had escaped unmolested, and the Austrians remained in good order despite being wedged between 2 sizable French forces and a major river. Historian Robert Palmer concludes that miscarriages and misunderstandings made the French victory incomplete. Contributing to these errors was of course the garrison of Maubeuge. Despite both sides anticipating attacks from the fort, the defenders remained absent while the Battle of Wattignies raged. This was by no means the fault of either Jourdan or Carnot, but it was an inexcusable blunder for the French military. Had some 20,000 men actually contributed to the fight, the outcome might have been very different. The guillotine awaited officers deemed inexcusably negligent. Taken altogether, historian Ramsay Phipps quips that much of the French triumph rests in no small part on the coalition's failings, rather than the Republic's success. Yet, while the victory at Wattignies was only minor from a military perspective, the defeat of the Austrian army was a major achievement nonetheless. Like Hondschoote, the invaders had been repulsed, now for the second time in as many months. French propaganda was ecstatic. The mood of the nation surged with the Republic's unexpected success. Combined with the defeat of Federalist Lyon a week prior, France was undoubtedly back in the fight. The fact that the coalition remained on French soil was, to an extent, irrelevant. Wattignies was consequential because of the symbolic and political consequences, not military matters alone. Crucially for the Committee of Public Safety, the successful defence of both Dunkirk and Maubeuge solidified its own grip on power. Threatened by ultra-radicals who desired more extreme measures, their demands for greater revolution were partially discredited. Likewise, the concerns of moderates seemed equally unfounded, for had the committee not achieved the impossible? The Allies had been checked. Lyon had been recaptured. Even the Vendée was coming under control. Much work remained, yes, but the revolutionary government was evidently reversing the nation's terrible misfortunes. However, despite all of this, Wattignies was not all good news for the French, and not just because the Austrians had escaped. In the aftermath of Hondschoote, the Republic's success had enabled greater cooperation between the Allies. This had allowed their defence of French incursions into Belgium and resulted in the near loss of Maubeuge weeks later. Now, the triumph at Wattignies had created a new vulnerability. In order to raise the manpower required for the summer's miracles, Carnot had been pulling men from across the northern armies. This manpower advantage had been crucial at both Hondschoote and Wattignies, but the ability to do so was partially predicated on Allied inaction elsewhere. In October, the Prussians over in the Rhineland finally decided to end their summer vacation. Rousing themselves for battle, the legendary army of Frederick the Great returned to the field. A full account of the Rhinelandic front would take considerable time. Given that this theatre is defined by the actions of Saint-Just as a representative on mission, I have a sneaky suspicion that we will return to Alsace in great detail when we examine the career of this most divisive revolutionary. However, what matters for our purposes now is that the situation to the east largely mirrored what we've seen in Flanders and northern France. At first, a sudden invasion into French territory decimated local resistance. Thereafter, coalition dysfunction crippled the advance. With the Allies focused on individual aims rather than the bigger picture, the French were given time. Precious, precious time. Using this to the fullest, the emerging generals Hoche and Pichegru combined with the deputy Saint-Just to deliver a near miraculous salvation. By the end of the year, the coalition had withdrawn from eastern France, following their defeat at Wissembourg. The Second Battle of Wissembourg delivered a third major victory for the French. Like Hondschoote and Wattignies, the military outcome was not decisive, but the Allies had once again been checked. This itself was a major accomplishment, especially given the vulnerability of Strasbourg just weeks prior. Further south, the good news kept coming. As the French prepared to expel the coalition from Alsace, Toulon fell to the Republic. Likewise, the French had repelled an invasion from Piedmont Sardinia in September, this time when the Republic did not enjoy numerical superiority. Finally, the War of the Pyrenees was also seeing considerable success. Spain's invasion had commenced in April, but after initial victories, the Spanish advance had stalled. Armed with a near-endless supply of new recruits, the French drove them back. Critically, the highs and lows of the war with Spain will be the focus of our next episode, an interview with Major Michael Hamel. Thus, as 1794 dawned for the French Republic, the nation's fortunes were on the rise. Just 6 months prior, the Federalist revolts had consumed half the country, the Vendéans were on the march, and the frontiers in every direction were menaced by the unstoppable coalition. Now, as winter froze hostilities at the end of the new year, the fortunes of war were changing. Thanks to unprecedented reforms to their army and the selfish stupidity of their foes, the French had found success. Yes, it was costly. Yes, it was riddled with mistakes. But France had scored victories nonetheless. Victories it desperately required. From Belgium to the Alps, From the Rhineland to the Pyrenees, the French had held the line and turfed the enemy back. Well, most of them. You see, before we can return to the capital, before we can witness the de-Christianization campaign of 1793 and the internal struggles of the Jacobins, we must venture west and conclude a separate but no less gruesome struggle. In fact, so great were the horrors of the Vendée that the conflict continues to scar modern France. Amidst the fighting and reprisals, and of course the mass executions by drowning, some historians see something more than just terror and civil war. Some see genocide. The atrocities in the Vendée remain one of the revolution's most contested chapters. Thank you for listening to episode 89, The Republic Strikes Back. In the next episode, we'll be exploring the Spanish front with historian Michael Hamill, before commencing our first ever biographical episode on Lazare Carnot, the famed organiser of Victory. Of course, if you can't wait for more grey history, why not join the revolution? There's a ridiculous amount of bonus content, ad-free listening, the community chat room, and early access to the next episode for those on the true revolutionary tier. I could really use your help to keep this podcast in the fight, so please donate a mere coffee or two and support history that isn't black and white. Join the community today at patreon.com. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Joining the fantastic heroes are the fabulous champions of the people: Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Regis, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, and Sophia.